conversion and his conception of God in the universe. They were some books by the Platonists, translated from Greek into Latin by Victorinus, about whom Augustine tells more in 8.3, and the writings of the Apostle Paul. You have read selections from both. For our discussion, be prepared to cite examples from the Confessions that reflect the influence of Plato and Paul. Anyone would like to start off with some reflections? Anything? Yes, Zach.
On page 111 of book 7, I think it's chapter 1. He's talking about how by now I'm evil looking at his dad as his first sentence. And then right below that, he has a reference to Plato. He's talking about God occupying infinite space in a diffused form, which is like his mistaken notion of God. And so right off the bat, we get a reference from Plato. And it continues throughout book 7, and I believe book 8 as well, somewhere, in which he's like just references really. He uses Plato as really reference material for some of these old thoughts that he had before his conversion, as he was approaching God, trying to understand God, Christianity, and I thought that was just interesting how a lot of his kind of perceptions of what God is and how we can understand it takes away from Platonic philosophy.
Yeah. Well,
I thought it was really interesting how in book 7, page 121, chapter 14, he said he brought up the forms.
which section?
I'm sorry. 7 and chapter 14, page 121. He brought up the forms that Plato mentions, and I thought it was really interesting because he has this big. Augustine has this big struggle about like the kind of embodiment of God, and whereas it's like the similarities between like the forms of the good and and God, I guess for him are like kind of similar. Like they're both kind of like aspatial, and like they both like transcend time in a sense, and like they transcend like space in a sense, and like the forms, like Plato describes the forms as perfect, like they don't change, they're like their purest thing, and that all objects are copies of the form, and I think that goes along well with how kind of Augustine tries to like describe God and like the influence of God.
Okay, so and applied to this is like, what am I trying to say? Is are the forms essentially just like archetypes that things we categorized into for the most part? Like just general like.
Yeah, in a sense. So I think it's kind of like the forms are like the ideal thing. Like for example, like if someone were to think of a triangle or a circle, like you think of like a perfect circle, even though it's really hard to emulate like a perfect circle. So it's kind of like the matter, like objects, the matter are kind of like copies of what the form, like trying to do what the form actually is. And if I remember correctly, Plato describes like the way to get to the forms is through knowledge and through philosophy. So, yeah.
Okay, so then he would be following this kind of like guideline of the forms, because he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But he's not just saying this; he's also using this. I think he thought it was, or he placed emphasis on the Neoplatonic ideas as well. And I just thought it was interesting how he kind of used those ideas to like bolster his own Christian faith. And I just thought that was interesting. That's kind of what you're saying, like with the whole using knowledge and like ideas in order to have a better understanding of forms.
Okay, we need to know what forms are.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's get.
Why? Okay. What have you read of Plato?
Allegory, the Cave, Republic.
Plato's Republic.
You read the Republic?
Yeah.
Okay. What parts of the Republic?
The whole thing.
The whole thing? All right. So what are the forms?
There's the form of the good is the highest form.
What is the form conceptually, though?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not what examples of the forms are, but what is, this is,
It transcends
I mean, and so this is, okay,
It's just like the purest form of something in its own sense.
no,
It's the idea of something.
okay, all right. You've got to go back and you've got to figure out what a Platonic form is, right? I mean, that is the sine qua non of understanding Augustine's concept of God. This is the breakthrough for him that allowed him to understand or develop his own idea of God. If you don't know what a Platonic form is, you've got to do your homework, okay? You can't just, oh, he mentions Plato someplace, I found it here. No, that's not the point. This is absolutely the breakthrough for Augustine in understanding the concept, because what has he conceived of God up to this point?
Something.
Is physical.
There has to be some sort of physical something, right? Some corporeal, some material manifestation. And what are the problems with that?
Well, God's not free.
He's infinite. Is like the notion of Christianity is that God is infinite, omnipresent. So
Okay.
He's not necessarily
It's
a physical form, so that kind of contradicts the whole idea.
Why?
because anything with matter is
Anything with matter.
a limitation.
Okay, so play this out. Why is this the stumbling block for Augustine?
He was
He was taught by Manichees, that Manichees who thought in physical form.
Right.
And then having thought that way, now that he's disillusioned with their beliefs, he can't wrap his mind around anything else.
Right? Okay. All right. So, and in specific, he goes through complex arguments why the corporeal understanding of deity is not going to work. What are some of his arguments? If God is made of some substance, what is the problem with that?
he would have
Let's just imagine for a second that God is like neutrinos, right? And it goes through, and
It's,
and God is everywhere. So what are the problems from Augustine's point of view?
he said that if God is in all of us, but at the same time, it's not like a coffee cup is
Uh-huh.
a part of God.
Uh-huh.
It's just because God is within everything doesn't mean it can be like divided and own like one thing. For instance, one thing that might be smaller doesn't have less of God in it than another.
Very good. That's certainly one of the arguments. Well, then a gnat would have less of God in it than an elephant, okay? And that was incompatible with his notion of God infusing or diffusing through everything, right? And this was an issue that came up with the materialists, right? With Epicureanism, that the soul is a material object and it occupies our body, it diffuses our body. So when we lose an arm or a leg or something, we lose, part of the soul that was associated with that, but we don't lose the soul entirely, right? Okay. So this was an issue for him, okay?
He also talks about the problem of evil. So it's like if God is something physical, then how does evil creep into something like of this good form? He talks about that.
Why is that a problem for him? Why is substance and the question of evil a problem for him?
Because God created all things, and if God created all things, then he created evil, and that doesn't make sense to him.
It doesn't make sense, right? So
Didn't he say that if one good thing is incompatible with another good thing, that's when evil exists?
Right.
yes, but that has nothing to do with, but that's separate. That's a conclusion that he comes to as a consequence of this, that evil cannot be immaterial. In other words, that gets back to Abby's point about the teachings of Mani, is that evil was in fact a substance, okay? That the universe, there's good substance and there's bad substance, right? So that's not going to happen. So the spatial dimension of God is a problem for him because it was impossible for him to conceive, probably impossible for anyone to conceive, of a material object that would fill the universe, right? And not in some way be subject to division, right? That is to segmentation, to being limited in some way, Yes, Jim.
In book 8, chapter 1, line 18, it says, "There's an indestructible substance from which comes all substance," which is kind of what we've been talking about. And he also says, my desire was not to be more certain of you, but to be more stable in you. And I think that what he's trying to allude to there is that he wasn't trying to, he wasn't doubting that this substance existed, but more he just wants to understand it. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at. Am I wrong?
Well, it's clear that substance exists.
Right.
We can see this. This is a matter of perception. We ourselves are made of matter, and so we know that matter exists. Okay. What is the problem with believing that God is made of this matter?
It's corruptible
It's corruptible in what way?
in the sense of visions and proportions, like you were saying, about what fails and what it's attached to, and how that transfers over that process of where is it more concentrated, and if it's evenly distributed.
And if he's a physical form, then how can he be everywhere?
Right. Mhm. And this comes back to the arguments of the immortality of the soul in Plato, right? The immortality of the soul. If this something cannot be immortal if it's divisible.
Isn't that what his main problem with it is with that whole idea is that you can't represent God in a physical form, which kind of ruins the idea of Christ's embodiment in the human world.
Well, okay, so God cannot have a corporeal existence. Okay, can't have that.
Right.
Jesus is another issue, right?
Is that a different kind of extension of God, or is it? Maybe I misunderstood. I assumed that he was kind of referring to Jesus and God as kind of the same entity, kind of with similarly in how we saw those two compared and contrasted in Paul. So I assumed that he was discussing them as the same entity. But if Jesus is more just an extension of God, a different manifestation of the substance, then that's a whole different story, I guess.
There's no, okay, so, all right, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say something on that. Like, it seems like he's actually referring to it more in the sense of like, the Jesus being part of the Holy Trinity rather than being part of God. Like in book 7, 14, he references a verse where he says Jesus is Lord in the glory of God the Father. And then right after that, he says, your only begotten Son immediately abides eternal with you. But that may have meant that like if he abides eternally with God within him, but to me it seemed more as he was referencing Jesus as a separate entity, more in the traditional sense of the Holy Trinity as being 3 separate units rather than 3 divisions of a singular being.
This is an issue we talked about at the workshop, though, that if Jesus was going to have a beginning, that would imply that he would have an end, and that made the Council of Nicaea, some of those individuals uncomfortable.
I think
These are the Arians. This is the Arian.
I think the Platonic books in general just kind of like make him realize, okay, there are so many contradictions, and eventually he's just going to have to learn to transcend and just have faith.
No,
That makes sense. You don't
that's
think so?
not at all his engagement. It's not, there are different views. Plato had a very clear and very specific understanding of the universe, okay? And Augustine reads this and experiences in that, he sees that both in the combination of the writing, the Neoplatonic of Platonic writings, and in the teachings of the New Testament, okay, the documents that we see, in particular John, all right, which he views as a Neoplatonic text, okay? It's a breakthrough for him.
Can we talk about how I describe forms
Sure.
correctly?
Sure.
Because, I was under the impression that I didn't understand it.
Well, okay, so let's talk about what are the forms. Take for example the allegory of the cave. What is what are forms? How do they work?
Well, the allegory, it's all about this journey from like one man's place in the cave to the outside to where the sun is the good, the truth, this form of pure goodness, and like the epitome of that. But these forms can transfer from like physical to this sort of metaphysical sense, because he starts off this guy's understanding of the forms as the shadows that he sees as he's chained against the wall of this cave. Then somebody's released from it, and he's dragged out from the shadows. He sees like the fire that had caused the shadows to play upon the walls, and then he goes from there, seeing the instruments of like the shadows to outside the cave, where he sees the trees and he's looking down because the sun's too bright. He sees these forms of like nature, and then once he sees these forms of nature, and he's looked up on long enough, been outside long enough, he's able to look up into the sun, but still it's blinding. In the sense, like, because it's a comparison to the sun in that physical sense. But still the notion that this higher notion of truth is kind of not really transferred, but radiates upon like the sun, all the other forms in which we can see. And there's like pretty much like this scale of forms in a way as it approaches this kind of sense of non-physical, the perfect form. Because like Will was saying, like we can all imagine the perfect triangle, but once we try to illustrate it from our own mental notion to a physical sense, that's where the problem occurs, because we can't do that. But we're still united in the sense that we do have that same thought of the triangle.
So yeah, I was under the impression that the forms were like they were gained through knowledge, and what the forms are like the perfect and most pure forms of certain physical things. I wrote some notes down on it. Like the forms don't change.
Excellent.
To think of the ideal form, one must be able to separate the object from the form.
Absolutely.
I have that. And I also have that they're aspatial and atemporal. So these are just from like last semester.
Absolutely. Very good. Excellent.
And so in like the form of the good, like which is the highest one, kind of dishes out all of the positive qualities that you assign to the forms. So is that still an incomplete understanding?
No. I think we're getting there. Okay. For one thing, that the forms, that what we see in the world today is a corporeal, material representation of the forms. Okay, so take for example the form of the chair, right? The chair. That is that we would say that this is a chair, right? Okay. Is there some way in which this table can be a chair?
Yeah.
Why not?
You can sit on it.
You could sit on it, right?
You could take it apart and make it into a chair.
Yeah, I mean, so when we say tree, okay, we can look at all of these trees out there are completely different. They're all unique, okay, but they're still trees, and we recognize them as trees. And we recognize as trees even little teeny things. In fact, a little teeny thing that comes out of the ground. If we know that that's an oak tree, we would call that a tree, right? Even though it doesn't bear it looks like a blade of grass, really, okay? But we know that it's a tree. Why do we know? Why is that a tree?
Because the form is unchanging.
Because it partakes of the form of the tree. The form of the tree does not exist. Right? Representations of the form, they exist. Okay, so you're absolutely right. These are non-spatial, they don't exist in space, right? They don't exist in time, right? And they are abstract. The only way, there is only one way to approach the Platonic form, and what is that? It's a mental, rational process.
Yeah.
Is that
One does not experience a form in any corporeal or sensory way.
Is that what he's saying on chapter 7, section 16, where it says, by the Platonic books I was admonished to return into myself?
Well, that is part of it.
Okay, because I was trying to just like interpret that whole section, because I feel like it's pretty important, but it was just kind of like confusing, the terminology that he uses. Because he says stuff like, I entered, and with my soul's eye, such as it was, saw above that same eye of my soul the immutable light higher than my mind, not the light of every day, obvious to anyone. And then he goes on to say, it transcended my mind.
There we go. There we go. Okay. So this is a breakthrough, and it enables him to conceive of God as what? A form.
Yeah, especially.
And that has no spatial constraint. I mean, you can think of it like a mathematical equation, if you will, okay? Something that exists conceptually, but not physically. And conceptually, let's go, I want you to look in the end of 9, in his conversation with Monica, his mother, shortly before she dies.
Which chapter is that?
9.
Oh, sorry.
It's in book 9.
Oh. Is it when he's talking about eternal wisdom?
It's towards the end here, yeah.
So, like you were saying, talking about like the trees, like okay, you see 2 different trees, but you still know they're trees. Can that kind of like is he like saying like now that God is a form, he can see lots of different things and still see God, since everything was made through God?
Well, essentially that the form of the divine, of God, is essentially everywhere.
Okay, so technically speaking, everything would resemble that God form.
Isn't it?
Or remind
Wouldn't resemble, but it would share in the form of the divine.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so have we found that passage where he's talking with his mother at the very end?
We're talking about the sentence in chapter 25, page 172, book 9, where he says, it's like in the middle of the page, he says, that is how it was when at that moment we extended our reach, and in a flash of mental language, he attained the eternal wisdom which abides beyond all things.
There we go, okay. This is 24, let's read 24. Who wants to read it for us? Abby, go ahead. All of 24.
It's still chapter 7.
This is book 9.
The conversation led us towards the conclusion that the pleasure of the bodily senses, however delightful in the radiant light of this physical world, is seen by comparison the life of eternity to not be even worth considering. Our minds were lifted up by an ardent affection towards eternal being itself. Step by step, we climbed beyond all corporal objects in the heaven itself, where sun, moon, and stars shed light on the earth. We ascended even further by internal reflection and dialogue, and wonder at your works, and we entered into our own minds. We moved up beyond them, so as to attain to the region of inexhaustible abundance, where you feed Israel eternally with truth for food. Their life is the wisdom by which all creatures come into being, both beings which were and which will be. But wisdom itself is not brought into being, but is as it was and always will be. Furthermore, in this wisdom there is no past and future, but only being, since it is eternal. For to exist in the past or in the future is no property of the eternal. And while we talked and panted after it, we touched it in some small degree by a moment of total concentration of the heart, and we sighed and left behind us the first fruits of the Spirit, bound to that higher world as we return to the noise of our human speech, where a sentence has both a beginning and an ending. But what is to be compared with your word, Lord of our lives? It dwells in you, without growing old, and gives renewal to all things.
Okay, all right. So there we have, not even human speech is capable of articulating or describing or even comes close to it, because human speech, the sound waves, are bounded by temporal constraints, right? Spatial and temporal constraints. So not even talking about it can we even get there. It is purely a mental process. It is purely conceptual. So when he reads, as some of you pointed out, in chapter 7 about the Logos, about John, there was the Word. This is what he interprets as this form, as Plato described it, of God. That it has no corporeal existence. It has no spatial constraint. It exists. Okay, it exists. And so questions about time, about the past, the future, none of that matters, because in this moment, it is in this form of the divine, it is all encompassing. We all share in that equally, right? Because you can think of it as there are different ways that, sort of Aristotle views it as sort of the great plan, the mechanism that was put into motion, that by which the world functions. Lots of different conceptions about this. The Stoics viewed this as this sort of animating influence, and when we die, our soul rejoins this fiery sort of rational world. There are different concepts of this, but here for Augustine, this was an important moment, because he, in this section, he transcended all of these sort of corporeal constraints under which he was working, and spatial constraints too, to see really a Platonic God. Augustine embraces the notion of deity as a form. Right? No spatial, no temporal, no corporeal constraints. So when Socrates dies, and he talks about it, that this is going to be a great thing, because we are limited in our ability to perceive this by the imperfections of our corporeal existence, by our senses. Okay? Our senses do not provide us with the kind of data and information that we really need to perceive. This is the allegoric of the cave, for example. That it's only when we can shed the limitations of our physical body that we get closer to this. Now, this is going to be really important, because this lays the foundation for Dante's Divine Comedy. Right? That there is this notion of comprehension, of understanding, but it is something that will only take place in the spiritual realm. Right? And Dante will take you essentially through this process, okay, in the imagination of his the way he imagines it, that he will take you up through this. And so the notion of this ultimate moment in the culmination of the Divine Comedy, where everyone is in like a theater, and everyone is observing, right, God, right, in this spiritual realm. Okay, this completely. I think this is Dante's attempt to describe what this must be like at this moment.
Didn't you say earlier that you disagreed with Augustine on almost like every aspect in his Confessions?
Yeah.
I was just wondering why. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, there are a lot, for example, that start, with the concept of original sin. Okay, right? That's just one thing, but there's a whole variety of things which I disagree with. Yeah. Yes, other observations.
Anybody have anything else?
He isn't talking about Paul as near as much as, but still really significant, even though it's less frequent. He says reference Corinthians and Romans a lot, and that's how he actually fully converted, was by reading a letter to the Romans, some random passage in there. But something that I noted in his Confessions was in book 6. Sorry? No, not book 6. Sorry. So we're from, yeah, book 7. Sorry, book 7, chapter 27, I think. Yeah, 27. And he mentions, he talks about Paul and how Paul believed that we can approach God to like believing in him without believing in him. So like even though we may not currently believe in him, we can still be on that path towards him, towards this sort of enlightenment. And as he's trying to also chisel out this Platonic theory of the form of God. And so yeah, he doesn't really reference Paul as much, but I still think it's significant, if not equally significant, to Plato, since they go hand in hand with his conversion. Even though he really references Paul more to like resisting corporeal things, when it comes to just how to live physically and spiritually, just not really thinking of metaphysical beings.
What is it about, what do you think that he saw in Paul that led to this? Paul is very different from Plato, right? What was it about Paul that he felt was so compelling?
Maybe he can relate with Paul's faith.
In what way?
Well, I'm saying Plato wasn't necessarily a man of God, whereas Paul obviously was. So maybe he was able to relate. I don't know, this is hypothetical, but maybe he was able to relate with his views more easily.
But also, Paul wasn't even provisionally religious.
Yeah, the
This could be
Conversion.
similar story.
Okay, so he connects with Paul in terms of his religious experience. Paul having been a ardent sort of critic of and persecutor of the Christian community, right? Augustine, although not a persecutor, certainly because he grew up in a semi-Christianized household, but still was highly critical of it, okay, and went through these different transformations, studying the Manichaees, for example, okay, embarking on a career as an intellectual, right, scholar, teacher, and then coming around to this sort of thing, and Paul being the mechanism for his ultimate conversion in the garden there, as described in book 8, right? So I do think that there's a connection there. Are there other ways in which you feel that Paul and Augustine were, why Augustine would respond to Paul's?
I have one.
Yes.
Well, I thought it was interesting how like a passage from Romans inhibited his conversion, because when we read it, we talked about how it was more somatic and it was impersonal because he had never actually met the Romans.
Mhm.
And I know in the last section he talked about how when he was reading the Bible, he took it at face value and it was hard to like read through the metaphors and everything.
Mhm.
But I think with Romans, it was easier for him to like identify and connect because it was clearly stated.
Okay.
And like one by one, like what he should do.
Okay.
And it actually like touched him personally, and even said like his eyes lit on book 8, page 153, chapter 29. And it like he responded in such an emotional way, but yet we said that like Paul wasn't very emotional and like connected to the Romans. So I just thought that was interesting.
And Romans is also kind of like the most outlined and kind of say like ordered, not ordered,
Like outlines and principles.
outlined principles like compared to Corinthians. Like,
And then he ends
Much
it
more
saying all the shadows.
what they should do. Sorry, go ahead.
And then he ends it saying all the shadows of doubt were dispelled. So like he makes it clear that it was completely like outlined for him, so he understood it in a way that he could follow.
Similar lifestyle to Paul too, constantly traveling, changing location. The way Paul traveled, obviously Augustine traveled a lot too. So lack of permanence.
Well, I don't think he would. I don't think Augustine. Paul was on the road going to these various communities. I mean, Augustine, compared to Paul, I think lives a pretty constant life. Grows up in Thagaste, goes to Carthage, goes to Rome, Milan, all part of his educational experience. Paul was really, and in all of these places, he benefited from a rather, I think, in most cases, a secure livelihood, a place where he lived. Okay, whereas Paul really had to go from place to place and was dependent. He was not. He took pride in not being dependent upon the others, and he sort of made his way. but not in the same way. Let me say this, that I think that, yes, Paul and Augustine traveled. If we really look closely, however, and compare the travels of Paul compared to those of Augustine, we see that they were of a completely different nature. Okay, and certainly far greater in terms of their extent, because Paul goes from ranges all the way from Jerusalem all the way over to Rome and into Italy. I mean, that's an extremely large thing. Augustine is really just going back from the seats of Roman civilization, from northern Africa, which was a Romanized part of the empire, to Rome and to Milan and back. I mean, this is a very fairly restricted sort of cultural experience that he's having. So yeah, they did see parts of the world, but not in the sense that that Paul did. But I mean, on the other hand, there are, that he was able to experience, to connect with different communities, right? In Carthage and in Rome and Milan, we see him connecting with different groups in the same way that Paul connected with the different groups that he had. At Antioch, for example, in Corinth and Athens and elsewhere. So there are some parallels there.
Also, like, throws to Plato on the contention between wills, how he says there's two wills, like the carnal versus the spiritual. Now, like, when we're deliberating on something, the soul is always caught between different wills, and whether it's choosing between two things that are evil, like you talk about like how to kill somebody, or two good things, like what to read or what like psalm to choose from. How we're always in a state of conflict when making a decision like that. He talks about that in book 8,
right?
Chapter 10, page 148. Also, the deliberating aspect on page 149, chapter 23, 22, 23. So that was really interesting with how he addresses that decision-making process.
Right. So this is his concept of evil, right? What is his concept? Let's flesh this out a bit. What is he? How can you account for evil? What is evil in his world?
The lack of good, the diminishment of good until there's nothing. So it's not really a presence at all. It's just.
It's not anything, right? Evil doesn't exist in any sort of material way.
It's like how cold is just a lack of heat.
Yes, I guess you could think of it that way, but but essentially everything is good, and so that would, the opposite of that would be the absence of anything. Okay.
So just because we had like that big talk about the forms, so evil would be a form, would it? Because it transcends. So like, how would you characterize these other like hypotheticals, like evil and things like that, as opposed to like the forms? So like, what is the
how would a Stoic describe evil? What is evil for a Stoic?
For a Stoic, it would be a disturbance of the soul. Or is that
Okay, well, does evil exist in the universe to a Stoic? No, there is no evil in the universe, right? The only thing that it's how we respond to the universe that's the thing. Same thing with the Epicureans. There's no such thing as evil. An earthquake, or something, a disease, any of these things, are they evil? No, they're just part of the natural world, okay? It's how we perceive them as to whether they're good or bad,
right?
okay?
The forms are not part of the natural
The forms are not part of the natural world, and so evil can't exist. It doesn't exist in. So the question is, how can we account for sin? How can we account for this? And this is where Zach was talking a little bit about this, that it represents what is, because sin is from Augustine's point of view evil, right? And so sin is what?
It's the conflict of wills without.
So it's not. So what strictly speaking is sin?
It's your inability to choose correctly.
And, okay, so what constitutes choosing correctly?
Disobeying
God,
God.
What's that?
being in accordance with God, acting in accordance with God.
There you go, okay, all right.
Right.
So sinning is not doing, is not acting, is not behaving in a way that's consistent with the will of God. So then the question is, what is the will of God?
Yeah.
That's the hard part.
And how does one resist that? How does one end up sinning? What happens? And this sort of Augustine takes you through this process. It's very Aristotelian.
Prioritization of the current life over the afterlife, I guess. I don't know exactly what he said.
No, it has, I mean, one of the crucial elements in the Augustine system, which is Aristotelian, is habituation. Is that this conflict of the will, so that's the origin of all of this sort of sin. It's the conflict of the will. It's the moment at which our desires, our wills, become in some way discordant with those of divine will. Right? And that's what he's experienced all this time, is his inability for him to act on what he thought and to be the will of God, right? And it's aligning one's will with the will of God. And as a consequence of that moment when that alignment stops in some way, when something gets out of alignment, and it's through the habituation, the practice of that disalignment, that sin emerges. And so really the opposite of that is the continual habituation of aligning one's will with God.
Yeah. In Aristotle's, like, we didn't read it, but in Aristotle's Politics too, he says kind of like the same thing with the state. Like, he gives like that boat analogy of how everyone should be kind of like acting accordingly, I guess, in habituation with like their role and how it's going to probably benefit the state. So I guess you can also apply that in a more spiritual way.
Right, absolutely. All right, I think we're out of time. Are we? Oh, we're way out of time. All right, well, thank you. Have a great